So in this last part of chapter 23, we're going to talk about what happens with these high energy electron carriers that we've been generating in both glycolysis and the citric acid cycle. So you'll hopefully remember that both NADH and FADH2 are high energy molecules that have enough energy to produce multiple molecules of ATP. Now, during glycolysis, we generated a couple of NADH molecules as we broke glucose down into pyruvate. And then in the citric acid cycle, after pyruvate is converted into acetyl-CoA, those two carbon atoms are cycled through the citric acid cycle, where we make 3 more molecules of NADH and 1 molecule of FADH2. Now, both of these molecules are high energy molecules, but they aren't high energy molecules that are used by most of the reactions in a cell. And so the energy that's carried by these has to be converted into ATP. Now that's carried out by the delivery of electrons, of the high energy electrons carried by these molecules to other molecules in the electron transport chain. So there are multiple high energy electron carriers that chapter 23 talks about, but these are the only 2 that we're really going to focus on. So the bottom line with electron carriers is that they are going to be oxidized to deliver electrons and energy to other molecules. Now those molecules are going to be involved in the electron transport chain. Now the electron transport chain occurs in the mitochondria. Now we talked about glycolysis. Glycolysis occurs in the cytosol, or the cytoplasm of a cell. The citric acid cycle is carried out in the matrix of the mitochondria. So you'll notice 2 membranes of the mitochondria. The outer membrane is smooth. The inner membrane has all these little indentations or invaginations. And then the interior of this is referred to as the matrix. Now the matrix is where the citric acid cycle takes place, and so that's where all of our NADH and FADH2 molecules are being formed. Now the electron transport, or the conversion of that energy to ATP, is going to take place by complexes present right here within the membrane of the mitochondria. So it's going to take the energy from electron carriers, such as NADH and FADH2, and take the hydrogens and electrons and ultimately deliver them to oxygen, which is going to produce water. Now remember that we talked about the breakdown of glucose and how we get the most energy out of it when oxygen is present. And at the very end of this process is where the actual molecule of oxygen is going to be used. So all of this requires or takes place under aerobic conditions. The ultimate product then of electron transport is going to be water. So we utilize oxygen as a reactant and we produce water as a product. So the first products of the complete oxidation of glucose were 3 carbon dioxide molecules. We saw those when pyruvate was converted to acetyl-CoA, and then we saw 2 more produced during the citric acid cycle. So that gives us our 3 carbon dioxide molecules per pyruvate molecule. And here we're going to create our water molecules. And again, the ultimate point of all of this is to produce ATP, the high energy molecules that are used by most reactions in the cell. So the electron transport system is housed in 4 very large complexes within the membrane of the mitochondria. Now the 2 that you're going to want to make sure that you pay close attention to will be referred to as complex 1 and complex 2. There are 4 complexes total, but complex 1 and complex 2 are going to be the 2 entry points into the system as a whole. So complex 1 is going to be the front door by which NADH enters the process, delivers oxygen, delivers electrons to the system, which will ultimately be delivered to oxygen. Complex 2 is a side door, and FADH2 is delivered to complex 2. Now we're going to go through these complexes not because you need to know all the details, but because the complexes will set up a situation that will drive the ability of the mitochondria to produce ATP by a very large complex called ATP synthase. So it's the molecules, the protein complex that produces ATP. Now it's going to accomplish that because of a proton gradient. So this area right here, this is the outer membrane of the mitochondria right here. This is the inner membrane of the mitochondria right here, these little indentations. And then these protons are accumulated within the space between the membranes. So there's going to be low protons inside the matrix, which is the space all the way on the inside. So low proton concentration here and high proton concentration here, which is established during the movement of the electrons through the electron transport system. So complexes 1, 3, and 4 move protons from the matrix into the space between the membranes. So the protons create a proton gradient, which will then be used to produce ATP. So ADP plus a phosphate and the energy provided by the proton gradient are going to be what drive the synthesis of ATP. So this figure shows the 3 complexes that are responsible for translocating protons or moving protons from within the matrix into the space between the 2 membranes. Now, the reason that they move protons from one side of the membrane to the other is because the electrons are moving from high energy places in each of these complexes to lower energy places in the complex. So if you guys have ever watched The Price is Right and you see the Plinko game, you see a puck that the person releases up high, and it bounces around and eventually settles into a lower energy space. And that's really what the electrons are doing as they pass through each of these complexes. So they start out as high energy electrons, and as they move down steps to lower energy levels, protons are moved across the membrane so that lots of protons end up here in this space. Now the NADH electrons are delivered at complex 1 as the front door, and the FAD electrons are delivered at complex 2. So NADH is responsible for the translocation of 2 more protons across the membrane than is FADH2. Now eventually the electrons, when they get to their lowest energy state, they're going to be here at the end of complex 4. Now at the end of complex 4, the electrons are going to be accepted by an oxygen atom. The oxygen atom is going to be complexed with 2 protons, and the combination of those 2 will produce water. So this is where the aerobic part of our respiration takes place. So the role of oxygen takes place here at the very, very end of the electron transport chain. And again, that's where the water molecule is produced. Now all the protons that build up here between the 2 membranes will pass through an enzyme complex called ATP synthase. This is the enzyme that's responsible for taking an ADP molecule, combining it with a phosphate to make ATP. And we're going to look at that just in a little bit of detail in the next couple of slides. So ATP synthase has a part of the protein is complexed in the membrane, and that's where the protons will flow from high concentration to low concentration. So they're trying to get out of this place that's really, really crowded into the matrix where there are fewer protons. So they pass through this, and during that process, it causes this part of the molecule to turn, which is where ATP is synthesized. So the ATP is synthesized by the ADP and phosphate coming together in the complex, and as protons move one at a time through the membrane part, the shape of each of these compartments changes. So it starts out in a loose conformation where ADP and phosphate fit in individually, and then when a proton flows through the membrane, it's going to change the shape of this to a tight conformation, and that's where the ADP and the phosphate are forced into becoming one molecule of ATP. And then as another proton flows through, the shape of that chamber changes again, and the ATP is released. So for every 3 protons that pass through the complex, one ADP molecule is converted to ATP. NADH, which enters into complex 1, provides enough energy for 3 ATP molecules. A total of 10 protons are translocated across the membrane for every NADH molecule. So the NADH delivers electrons and hydrogens to complex with one oxygen atom to form H2O. And again, that's going to, at the same time, it's going to produce 3 ATP molecules. FADH2 has enough energy to produce 2 ATP molecules. So the FADH2 enters in at complex 2, so it's lacking the 2 extra protons that are moved because of NADH. So it enters in at complex 2, and it provides enough energy to make 2 ATP molecules. So the electron transport system is going to be turned on and off based upon the energy needs of the cell. So when there are low levels of the reactants, remember that the electron transport chain requires both ADP and phosphate as it makes ATP. It also requires oxygen to be present to accept the electrons at the very end. And remember that NADH is where the electrons and the high energy electrons are coming from to begin with. So if any of these components are low within the cell, then the electron transport chain will have a decreased amount of activity. However, if there are high levels of ADP, that indicates an energy deficiency in the cell. So high amounts of ADP can be used to make ATP, and it's going to derive the process of the electron transport chain. So hopefully, as you think about these different aspects of what decreases activity or what increases activity, you can see how that makes a lot of sense. So if you have any questions about that, let me know, but just ponder this process a little bit and try to make sure that you understand why low levels of any of these components will decrease the activity of the electron transport chain, and why high levels of ADP would increase the activity. Again, the whole point of the electron transport chain is to take high energy electrons from our NADH and FADH2 molecules and use those to drive ATP synthesis whenever the cell needs ATP to meet its energy needs.